Every empire in the known galaxy had one thing they agreed on. One simple, undeniable truth that no species ever questioned. The siege gate of Volmara could not be broken. Not by plasma cannons. Not by antimatter warheads. Not by the combined fleets of 7-star nations firing at the same time. That gate had stood for 9,000 years. It had survived wars that burned entire solar systems to ash. It had survived weapons that could crack moons in half. It had survived everything the universe had ever thrown at it. And then a human walked up to it, pressed his hands against its surface, and did the one thing the galaxy said was impossible. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. To understand why that moment changed everything, you need to understand what came before it. You need to understand the war. You need to understand the man. And most importantly, you need to understand why every alien species in the galaxy was already terrified of humans long before that gate came down. The war had been going on for 3 years when Sergeant Cale Morrow received his transfer orders. He was sitting in a field hospital on the planet Desra, watching medics pull shrapnel out of soldiers who had been too slow to dodge Vrithani mortarfire. The air smelled like burnt metal and antiseptic. Somewhere behind the medical tents, a transport ship was warming its engines, the low hum shaking the ground beneath his boots. Cale read the orders twice because he thought there had been a mistake. Transfer to the 9th Forward Assault Division. Deployment to the Volmara front. He folded the paper and put it in his chest pocket without saying a word. The soldier on the cot next to him, a young corporal with bandages wrapped around most of his face, turned his one visible eye toward Cale. "You look like someone just told you to walk into a furnace," the corporal said. Cale almost smiled. "Something like that," he replied. The Volmara front was the worst assignment in the entire war. Everyone knew it. The planet Volmara sat at the edge of Vrithani-controlled space, and it was the key to everything. If the Allied coalition could take Volmara, they could cut off the Vrithani supply lines and push deep into enemy territory. The war could be over within a year. But Volmara was not just any planet. It was a fortress world. The Vrithani had spent centuries turning it into the most heavily defended location in the galaxy. Orbital defense platforms circled the planet like rings of steel. Ground-based energy shields covered every major city. Anti-ship batteries could shoot down anything that entered the atmosphere without clearance. And at the center of it all, protecting the Vrithani command citadel and the planetary shield generator, was the siege gate. Cale had seen pictures of it during briefings. Every soldier had. The siege gate was not just a door or a wall. It was a monument to Vrithani engineering, a massive structure that stood over 300 meters tall and stretched nearly a kilometer wide. It was built from a material the Vrithani called vorium, a substance so dense and so resistant to energy that scientists across the galaxy had spent centuries trying to figure out how it was made. No one had succeeded. Vorium did not melt. It did not crack. It did not bend. It absorbed energy like a sponge absorbed water. You could fire a ship-grade plasma cannon at it for 100 years and the surface would not even get warm. The siege gate was the reason no one had ever conquered Volmara. It was the reason the Vrithani were winning the war. Cale boarded the transport ship that evening. The ship was a standard military carrier, grey and ugly and built for function rather than comfort. Inside, the cargo bay was packed with soldiers, most of them sitting on metal benches with their gear piled between their feet. The air recyclers hummed overhead, pushing out air that always tasted slightly metallic no matter how many filters they ran it through. Cale found a spot near the back and sat down. He was a tall man, broad across the shoulders, with hands that looked like they had been built for breaking things. His skin was dark brown, weathered by years of deployment on planets with harsh suns. His hair was cut close to his scalp, and there was a scar that ran from his left temple down to his jaw, a souvenir from a knife fight on the colony world of Brennan's Reach. He was 34 years old, and he had been fighting since he was 19. That was the thing about humans that the other species in the Allied coalition never quite got used to. Humans started fighting young, and they never seemed to stop. The transport jumped to faster-than-light speed, and the stars outside the small viewport windows turned into streaks of light. The journey to Volmara would take 6 days. Cale spent most of that time sleeping, eating ration packs that tasted like cardboard, and reading whatever he could find on the ship's limited data terminal about the Volmara campaign. The more he read, the worse it looked. The Allied coalition had been trying to take Volmara for almost 2 years. They had thrown everything they had at the planet. Fleet bombardments, orbital drops, ground assaults with tens of thousands of soldiers. Nothing had worked. The orbital defenses were too strong. The ground shields were too thick. And every assault that managed to get close to the Vrathani Command Citadel had been stopped cold by the siege gate. There were reports from engineering teams that had tried to breach it. They had used cutting lasers, molecular disruptors, sonic drills, even experimental gravity weapons that could crush starship hulls like tin cans. The gate had not even been scratched. The engineers had concluded, in language that was polite but clearly frustrated, that breaching the siege gate with current technology was not possible. Cale closed the data terminal and stared at the ceiling of the cargo bay. Around him, soldiers talked in low voices, played cards, or cleaned their weapons. A Talari soldier, tall and thin with blue-grey skin and forearms, was assembling and disassembling a plasma rifle with mechanical precision. A pair of Gorvithi, short and stocky with thick hides and wide, flat faces, were arm wrestling, their massive forearms straining against each other, and scattered among them, outnumbered but never outmatched, were the humans. The galaxy had only known about humans for about 60 years. First contact had happened when a Talari exploration vessel had stumbled across a human colony ship drifting through the outer reaches of the Orion Arm. The Talari had expected to find a primitive species, maybe pre-industrial, maybe just starting to figure out basic space travel. What they found instead was something that made them deeply uncomfortable. Humans were adaptable in ways that no other species in the galaxy could match. They could survive in temperature ranges that would kill most other sentient beings. They could eat almost anything organic and digest it. They healed from injuries that would be fatal to other species. They could function without sleep for days, push through pain that would shut down other nervous systems, and keep fighting long after any rational calculation said they should stop. But the thing that truly unsettled the other species was not the physical resilience. It was the psychology. Humans did not process fear the way other species did. Every other sentient species in the galaxy had evolved with strong self-preservation instincts that made them avoid hopeless situations. If a battle was unwinnable, most species would retreat, regroup, and find another way. It was logical. It was rational. It was how survival worked. Humans did not always do this. Sometimes when pushed far enough, humans did the opposite. They charged forward. They attacked when they should have run. They fought harder when they were losing than when they were winning. Military psychologists from other species had studied this behavior for decades and still could not fully explain it. The best theory anyone had come up with was that humans had evolved on a planet so dangerous, so full of predators and natural disasters and diseases, that somewhere deep in their genetic code, they had developed an override. When the situation became desperate enough, something switched on inside them. Fear did not disappear, but it stopped being the thing that controlled their actions. Instead, something else took over. Some scientists called it battle fury. Others called it the survival override. The humans had their own word for it. They called it stubbornness. The transport dropped out of faster-than-light speed on the 6th day, and Cale got his first look at Volmara through the viewport. The planet was beautiful in a cold, hostile way. It was mostly grey and brown, with vast mountain ranges and deep canyons cutting across its surface. There were no oceans, just scattered lakes of dark water that reflected the dim light of the system's red dwarf star. The atmosphere was thin but breathable, and the gravity was about 1.3 times Earth standard. Enough to make everything feel heavier, but not enough to be crippling. What dominated the view, though, was not the planet itself. It was the war. Even from orbit, Cale could see the signs of the ongoing campaign. Flashes of light on the surface marked artillery exchanges. Columns of smoke rose from burning positions. In orbit, the wreckage of destroyed ships floated in slowly expanding clouds of debris, glinting in the dim starlight. A Talari cruiser, broken nearly in half, drifted past the viewport, its hull blackened and torn open. Cale could see frozen bodies floating inside the exposed compartments. He looked away. The transport landed at Firebase Korath, the main coalition staging base on Volmara's northern continent. The base was a sprawling complex of prefabricated buildings, weapons emplacements and landing pads, all surrounded by layered energy shields and walls of reinforced concrete. It sat in a wide valley between two mountain ranges, with the Vrathani Command Citadel visible in the distance as a dark shape on the horizon, maybe 80 kilometers away. Between the firebase and the Citadel was 80 kilometers of the most heavily defended terrain Cale had ever seen. Minefields, automated turret networks, Brethani infantry positions. And behind all of it, visible even from this distance as a faint dark line against the grey sky, was the siege gate. Cale reported to the 9th Forward Assault Division's command post, a squat concrete building near the centre of the base. Inside, the air was warm and smelled like coffee and recycled air. Maps and tactical displays covered every wall, showing troop positions, enemy fortifications, and supply routes in glowing lines of blue and red. A colonel named Draven was waiting for him. Draven was a human, maybe 50 years old, with grey hair cut short and eyes that looked like they had seen too many people die. He shook Cale's hand and got straight to business. "You know why you are here," Draven said. Cale nodded. "The siege gate." Draven leaned back in his chair. "We have tried everything, Sergeant, and I mean everything. Conventional weapons do not work. Unconventional weapons do not work. We had a team of Gorviti engineers try to tunnel under it. The Vrethani have countermeasures for that too. The gate extends underground for another 200 meters. It is a complete barrier." Cale looked at the tactical display on the wall. It showed the siege gate as a thick red line, with the Vrethani citadel behind it and the coalition forces arrayed in front of it. He could see the positions of different units, the ranges of enemy weapons, and the approach routes that had been tried and failed. "What about going over it?" Cale asked. Draven shook his head. "The gate is connected to an energy shield that extends upward for another 500 meters. Anything that tries to fly over it gets destroyed. We have lost 47 aircraft trying that approach." Cale was quiet for a moment. "So, what is the plan?" he asked. Draven stood up and walked to the tactical display. He zoomed in on a section of the gate near its eastern edge. "There is something we have noticed," he said. "The gate is not one continuous piece. It is made up of interlocking segments. The joints between those segments are almost invisible, but they are there. Our scientists believe that the vorium in those joints might be slightly different from the rest of the gate, slightly thinner, slightly weaker." "Different how?" Cale asked. Draven turned to face him. "We do not know exactly. The difference is so small that our instruments can barely detect it. But the theory is that if enough focused, sustained force were applied to one of those joints, it might be possible to create a fracture. A small one, but a fracture is a fracture. Once the material is compromised, we might be able to expand the breach." Cale understood now why he had been transferred. He was not here because he was a good soldier. Although he was. He was here because of what had happened on Brennan's Reach. The mission there had gone wrong in every possible way. His squad had been cut off behind enemy lines, surrounded by Vrethani soldiers, with no air support, no extraction, and no ammunition. They should have died. Instead, Cale had led a breakout that lasted 14 hours. He had carried wounded soldiers on his back. He had fought hand-to-hand when his weapons ran dry, and at the end, when they had reached an abandoned Vrethani bunker that should have been sealed, Cale had forced open a blast door that was rated to withstand military breaching charges. He had gripped the edges of the door and pulled it apart with his bare hands. The door had been made of standard Vrethani military alloy, which was strong but nothing compared to Vorium. Still, the incident had been recorded, analyzed, and passed up the chain of command. Human baseline strength was already remarkable by galactic standards. Cale's strength was off the charts even by human standards. Medical scans had shown abnormally dense muscle fiber, bone density that was nearly twice the human average, and a nervous system that could recruit nearly all available muscle mass simultaneously, something that most humans could only do in extreme adrenaline responses. Cale could do it almost at will. "So you want me to punch a wall?" Cale said. Draven did not laugh. "I want you to be part of a team that is going to try something that has never been tried before," he said. "We are not sending machines at this gate anymore. Machines have failed. We are going to send people. Specifically, we are going to send a small team to the gate under cover of a major diversionary assault. The team will reach the eastern joint, and they will attempt to create a breach using focused manual force combined with experimental resonance amplifiers that our engineers have developed. The amplifiers will vibrate the Vorium at its resonance frequency. In theory, this will weaken the molecular bonds just enough, and then someone has to hit it hard enough and fast enough to create a crack before the bonds reform." Cale stared at the colonel. "That is not a plan," he said. "That is a prayer." Draven met his eyes. "Right now, Sergeant, a prayer is all we have." Cale spent the next 3 weeks at Firebase Korath preparing for the mission. He trained with the team that had been assembled for the breach attempt. There were 12 of them in total, 8 humans, 2 Telari, and 2 Gorvathi. Each one had been selected for specific skills. The Telari were engineers who would operate the resonance amplifiers. The Gorvathi were heavy weapons specialists who would provide covering fire during the approach. The humans were the assault element, chosen for their physical capabilities and their ability to operate in extreme conditions. Kale was the primary breacher. If the resonance amplifiers worked, if the Vorium weakened even slightly, he would be the one to strike the blow. The team trained together every day, running simulations, practicing their approach routes, and studying every piece of intelligence they had about the siege gate's defenses. The Vrathani did not just rely on the gate itself. There were automated weapons platforms built into the gate's surface, sniper positions on the walls above, patrol routes along the base. Getting close enough to touch the gate would be almost as hard as breaking through it. At night, Kale would sit outside the barracks and look at the distant silhouette of the siege gate on the horizon. It was always there, a dark line against the slightly lighter sky, like a wound in the landscape. Sometimes other soldiers would join him. They would talk about home, about the war, about whether they thought they would survive. Kale mostly listened. He was not a man who talked much about himself. But one night, a young private named Torres sat down next to him and asked the question that everyone was thinking but no one wanted to say out loud. "Do you really think you can break it?" Torres asked. Kale looked at the gate for a long time before answering. "I do not know," he said. "No one knows. That is kind of the point." Torres was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that Kale would remember for the rest of his life. "You know what I think," she said. "I think the reason they built that gate so big and so strong is because somewhere, deep down, they knew something like us was coming. Something that would not stop, and they were scared." Kale looked at her. Torres was maybe 22 years old, thin and wiry, with sharp eyes and a quick smile. She had been in the war for less than a year, and she already had the look of someone who had aged a decade in that time. "The war did that to people. Maybe," Kale said. "Or maybe they just really liked big walls." Torres laughed. It was a good sound in a place where good sounds were rare. The weeks of preparation passed quickly. Intelligence reports came in about Vrathani troop movements and defensive rotations. The engineering team made adjustments to the resonance amplifiers, trying to fine-tune them based on the limited data they had about Vorium's molecular structure. The diversionary assault was planned and coordinated with the main coalition forces. It would be the largest single offensive operation of the entire Volmara campaign. 3 full divisions would attack the western section of the Vrathani defensive line, supported by orbital bombardment and airstrikes. The goal was to draw as many Vrathani defenders as possible away from the eastern section of the gate, giving Kale's team a window to make their approach. Colonel Draven briefed them on the final plan the night before the mission. He stood in front of the tactical display, his face lit by the glow of the map, and laid out every detail. The approach route, the timing, the fallback positions, the extraction plan if things went wrong. When he was finished, he looked at each member of the team in turn. "I am not going to lie to you," he said. "The odds of this working are not good. But the odds of us winning this war without breaking that gate are worse. Everything we have fought for, everything we have lost comes down to this. If we can breach the gate, we can take the Citadel. If we take the Citadel, we can shut down the planetary shields. And if we shut down the planetary shields, the fleet can finish this." He paused. "So tomorrow we are going to do something impossible, because that is what humans do." No one spoke for a long time after Draven left the room. The team sat in silence, each of them dealing with the weight of what was coming in their own way. Kale looked at his hands. They were scarred and calloused. The hands of a man who had spent his life doing hard things in hard places. Tomorrow, he was going to ask them to do the hardest thing imaginable. He flexed his fingers, feeling the tendons shift under his skin, feeling the strength in them that had always set him apart. He had never asked for that strength. It had just been there, as much a part of him as his heartbeat. And tomorrow, it would either be enough or it would not. There was a strange peace in that simplicity. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep. Tomorrow was going to be a long day. The morning came cold and grey, the way mornings always came on Volmara. The red dwarf star hung low on the horizon, casting a dull light that made everything look like it had been dipped in rust. The air was thin and dry, and each breath Kale took felt like it was only half enough. He had been awake for an hour before the alarm sounded, sitting on the edge of his cot with his boots already laced, staring at the far wall of the barracks. Around him, the other members of the breach team were waking up, moving with the slow, deliberate motions of people who knew this might be the last morning they ever moved at all. Breakfast was served in the mess tent, a large prefabricated structure that could seat a few hundred soldiers at a time. The food was standard military rations: hot protein paste with synthetic bread, and something that was supposed to be coffee but tasted more like hot water that had once been in the same room as a coffee bean. Nobody complained about the food. Nobody talked much at all. The mess tent was full of soldiers from the Diversionary Assault Force, thousands of men and women and aliens who were about to throw themselves at the Western Brethani defensive line so that 12 people could sneak up to the eastern side of the gate. Kale watched them eating and talking and checking their gear, and he felt the weight of what they were doing settle on his shoulders like a physical thing. These soldiers were going to fight and bleed and die to give his team a chance. If he failed, all of that sacrifice would mean nothing. Torres sat down across from him with a tray of food she was not really eating. She pushed the protein paste around with a spork and tried to smile. "You look like you are thinking deep thoughts," she said. Kale shook his head. "Just thinking about the approach route." Torres nodded. She was part of the breach team too, assigned as one of the close protection element. Her job was to keep KL and the Talari engineers alive long enough to reach the gate. She was small and fast, an excellent shot with a plasma carbine, and she had a talent for staying calm when everything around her was falling apart. "I memorized the route 3 days ago," she said. "Every rock, every ditch, every dead spot in the Vrethani sensor coverage. I could walk it blindfolded." She paused. I would prefer not to walk it blindfolded, but I could." Kale almost smiled. "Good," he said, "because once the diversionary assault starts, we are going to have maybe 40 minutes before the Vrethani figure out what is happening and redirect their forces. 40 minutes to cover 3 kilometers of open ground under enemy observation." Torres pushed her tray aside. "Plenty of time," she said, and this time she did smile. A small, fierce grin that did not quite reach her eyes. The breach team assembled at their staging point at 0600 hours, a reinforced bunker at the eastern edge of Firebase Korath. The bunker was half buried in the rocky ground, its entrance facing away from the Vrethani lines. Inside, the team went through their final equipment checks. The 2 Talari engineers, whose names were Sarath and Vilan, inspected the resonance amplifiers one last time. The amplifiers were bulky devices, each one about the size of a human torso, with thick cables and focusing arrays that looked like the innards of some alien musical instrument. Sarath, the senior engineer, explained the principle one more time as she calibrated the devices. "Vorian has a molecular resonance frequency," she said, her 4 hands moving across the controls with practiced ease. "Every material vibrates at a certain frequency. If you match that frequency precisely, you can weaken the molecular bonds. The problem is that Vorium's frequency is extremely high and extremely precise. Our amplifiers can generate the frequency, but we need sustained contact with the gate surface for at least 90 seconds to have any effect. And even then, the weakening will be temporary. The bonds will reform within 30 to 40 seconds after we stop the amplification. 90 seconds to weaken it," Kale said, "and 30 seconds to break it." Sarath looked at him with her large, dark Talari eyes. "Yes," she said, "and I should tell you, Sergeant, that our models suggest the weakening will reduce Vorium's structural integrity by approximately 12%. Only 12%, Kale said. Sarath nodded. "I understand that does not sound like much," she said. And in truth, even with a 12% reduction, Vorium remains the hardest known material in the galaxy. Our models indicate that breaking through even the weakened Vorium would require a sustained force of approximately 400 kilonewtons applied to an area no larger than a human hand. She paused. That is roughly equivalent to the impact force of a small ground vehicle traveling at high speed. Kale flexed his hands. "And you think a person can generate that kind of force?" Sarath hesitated before answering. "The honest answer is that we do not know," she said. "No individual of any known species can generate 400 kilonewtons of sustained force under normal circumstances. However, our research into human physiology suggests that under extreme stress conditions, humans can temporarily exceed their normal physical limits by a significant margin. Your medical records indicate that you, in particular, have demonstrated strength outputs that should not be physiologically possible. We do not fully understand why. So our plan is based on a combination of engineering and hope." Kale appreciated her honesty. Most officers would have wrapped it in optimistic language and confident predictions. Sarath just told him the truth. He respected that. The two Gorvathy heavy weapons specialists, Brack and Donath, were checking their gear in the corner of the bunker. Gorvathy were built like walking boulders, short and wide with skin that was more like armor plating than flesh. Brack carried a heavy plasma repeater that most humans would need a tripod to fire. He held it in his thick arms like it weighed nothing. Donath carried a rotary grenade launcher and enough explosive ordnance to level a small building. Their job was simple: kill anything that got between the team and the gate. The remaining 6 humans on the team were all experienced combat soldiers, each one hand-picked for this mission. There was Torres, quick and sharp. There was Chen, a quiet man with steady hands and the best aim Kale had ever seen. There was Okafor, a massive woman who stood 6'4" and could carry a wounded soldier under each arm without slowing down. There was Reeves, a combat medic who had kept people alive in situations where death seemed like a foregone conclusion. There was Halloran, an explosives expert who could improvise a breaching charge from kitchen supplies. And there was Voss, a communications specialist who could keep the team connected to command even in the worst electronic warfare environments. At 0700 hours, the diversionary assault began. The first sign was a deep rumbling that Kale felt in his chest before he heard it. The coalition artillery opened up first, thousands of guns firing simultaneously at the western Vrethani defensive line. The sound was enormous, a continuous rolling thunder that shook the walls of the bunker and rattled loose equipment off shelves. Then came the orbital bombardment. From somewhere high above, coalition warships began dropping kinetic penetrators onto the Vrethani positions. Each penetrator was a solid tungsten rod accelerated to a fraction of the speed of light. When they hit the ground, they struck with the force of tactical nuclear weapons, sending columns of fire and debris shooting into the sky. The ground shook so hard that Kale had to brace himself against the bunker wall. Through the bunker's observation slit, he could see the western horizon lit up like a second sunrise. Flashes of white and orange and red, one after another, so close together they blended into a continuous wall of fire. That was the diversionary assault. 3 full divisions of coalition soldiers were charging into that fire, supported by armor and air support, throwing everything they had at the western Vrethani line. It was not a feint in the traditional sense. It was a real assault, with real objectives and a real chance of breaking through. The Vrethani would have to take it seriously. They would have to redirect forces to meet it, and for a brief window, the eastern approach to the gate would be lighter than usual. Colonel Draven's voice crackled over the team's communication channel. "Breach team, you are cleared to move. Good luck and give them hell." Kale looked at his team. Everyone was on their feet, weapons ready, faces set. He did not give a speech. There was nothing to say that had not already been said. He just nodded and said one word: "Go!" They left the bunker through a concealed exit on the eastern side and moved into the broken terrain between the firebase and the gate. The landscape was a nightmare of shattered rock, craters, and the wreckage of previous assaults. Burned-out vehicles lay scattered across the ground like the bones of dead animals. The remains of old trenches and bunker positions crisscrossed the terrain, half filled with rubble and dust. The team moved fast, using the terrain for cover, staying low and quiet. Kale was on point, his eyes scanning the ground ahead for mines and tripwires. Behind him, the team moved in a tight formation, each person covering their assigned sector. The sound of the diversionary assault was a constant presence, a distant roar that made the air vibrate. Kale could feel it in his teeth. They covered the first kilometer without incident. The Vrethani sensor coverage in this area was supposed to be reduced because of the diversionary assault, and it seemed like the intelligence was accurate. The team moved through a series of shallow ravines that provided good concealment, picking their way over loose rocks and around the rusted hulks of destroyed equipment. The gravity on Volmara made everything harder. Every step felt heavier than it should. The resonance amplifiers that Sarath and Villan carried on their backs weighed them down further, and the 2 Talari were breathing hard despite their 4-armed climbing ability. Kale slowed the pace slightly to keep the team together. Speed was important, but arriving at the gate as a coherent unit was more important. The trouble started at the 2nd kilometer. They were crossing an open stretch of ground between 2 ridgelines when Chen, who was on rear security, hissed a warning over the comms. "Movement, 200 meters south." Kale signaled the team to go to ground. Everyone dropped behind whatever cover was available. Kale pressed himself against a large boulder and slowly raised his head to look south. Through his optical enhancers, He could see a Vrathani patrol moving along a ridgeline about 200 meters away. There were 6 of them, tall and lean, moving in the distinctive flowing gait of their species. Vrathani were graceful creatures, almost beautiful in a cold and deadly way. They stood about 2 meters tall, with long limbs and smooth, pale skin that had a faint bluish tint. Their faces were narrow with large forward-facing eyes that could see into the infrared spectrum, and their mouths were small and lipless. They wore light armor that conformed to their bodies like a second skin, and they carried long-barreled energy weapons that Kale knew from experience could punch through standard Coalition body armor at 400 meters. The patrol was moving west, toward the diversionary assault. They had not spotted the breach team yet. Kale held up a closed fist, the signal for everyone to stay still and silent. For 2 minutes that felt like 2 hours, the team lay motionless in the dirt while the Vrathani patrol moved along the ridge. Kale watched them through his optical enhancers, barely breathing. If the patrol looked down into the low ground where the team was hiding, they would see them. It was that simple. The Vrathani would call in reinforcements, and the mission would be over before it started. The patrol passed without looking down. Kale waited another 30 seconds to be sure, then signaled the team to move. They got to their feet and continued the advance, moving faster now because they had lost time. The 40-minute window was ticking down, and they still had over a kilometer to cover. The terrain became rougher as they got closer to the gate. The Vrathani had cleared fields of fire around their defensive positions, cutting down anything that could provide cover and planting anti-personnel mines in the gaps. Halloran, the explosives expert, moved up alongside Kale, his mine detector sweeping the ground ahead in slow arcs. 3 times he held up a hand to mark a mine, and 3 times the team carefully stepped around it. The mines were Vrathani design, flat discs about the size of a dinner plate that were nearly invisible against the rocky ground. They were pressure-activated and powerful enough to take a person's legs off at the knees. At 2.5 kilometers, they hit their first real obstacle. A Vrathani observation post sat on a small hill directly in their path. It was a simple structure, a low bunker with firing slits and a sensor array on the roof. According to the intelligence briefing, this post was supposed to be unmanned during the diversionary assault, its garrison redirected to the western line. It was not unmanned. Through his optical enhancers, Kale could see at least 2 Vrathani soldiers inside, watching the eastern approach through their scopes. The sensor array on the roof was active, its dish rotating slowly. If the team tried to go around the post, they would lose too much time. If they tried to sneak past it, the sensors would detect them. There was only one option. Kale looked at Chen and Torres and made a series of hand signals. Silenced weapons, 2 targets, fast and clean. Chen nodded and unslung the long-barreled marksman's rifle from his back. It was a human-made weapon, a coil gun that fired a small tungsten projectile at hypersonic speed. It was nearly silent and devastatingly accurate. Torres moved to a position where she could cover Chen with her plasma carbine in case things went loud. Kale watched through his optical enhancers as Chen settled into a firing position, his breathing slow and steady. 2 shots, less than a second between them. The first Vrathani soldier jerked and fell. The second started to turn toward his fallen comrade, and then jerked and fell as well. Both shots were perfect, placed exactly at the base of the Vrathani skull where the nervous system could be shut down instantly. There was no sound except the faint whisper of the projectiles cutting through the thin air. The observation post went silent. Kale sent Halloran and Okafor up to the post to disable the sensor array and make sure there were no more Vrathani inside. They came back 2 minutes later with a confirmation. "Post is clear," Halloran reported. "Sensor array is offline. I also found their communications equipment and disabled it. They will not be checking in." The team moved on. Behind them, the diversionary assault was reaching its peak. The western horizon was a solid wall of fire and smoke, and the ground trembled continuously with the impact of heavy weapons. Kale could hear the faint crackle of energy weapons fire and the deeper boom of coalition artillery. Thousands of soldiers were fighting and dying right now, all to buy this small team a few more minutes. They crossed the 3-kilometer mark and got their first close look at the siege gate. It was overwhelming. Pictures and tactical displays did not capture the reality of it. The gate filled the entire horizon, a wall of dark, almost black material that rose from the ground like a cliff face and disappeared into the grey sky above. It had no visible seams, no joints, no features of any kind. It was smooth and featureless, absorbing the dim light rather than reflecting it. Standing this close, Kale could feel something coming off it. Not heat, not cold, but a kind of pressure, as if the air itself was denser near the gate's surface. The Vorium was doing something to the local environment, warping it in some subtle way that human senses could detect but not quite identify. The eastern joint was visible now, a barely perceptible line in the gate's surface about 50 meters to their right. It ran vertically from the ground up as far as Kale could see. A hairline crack that looked like a shadow or a trick of the light. If you did not know it was there, you would never notice it. Seraph had explained that the joints were where the individual Vorium segments of the gate met. The segments had been manufactured separately and assembled on site 9,000 years ago. The joints were sealed with a secondary Vorium compound that was almost but not quite identical to the primary material. That almost was the entire basis of their plan. But between the team and the gate, there was still the final defensive line. A trench system ran parallel to the gate's base, about 200 meters out. Kale could see movement in the trenches through his optical enhancers. Vrethani soldiers, at least a dozen of them, plus what looked like 2 automated weapons platforms mounted on the trench walls. The diversionary assault had drawn away most of the defenders, but not all of them. These were the garrison troops, the ones who stayed at their posts no matter what was happening elsewhere. They were disciplined and well-armed, and they were directly between the breach team and their objective. Kale gathered the team in a shallow depression about 300 meters from the trench line. They could not stay here long. The clock was ticking, and every minute they delayed was a minute closer to the Vrethani figuring out that the eastern approach was the real target. He laid out the plan quickly. Bracken Donath would provide heavy suppressive fire from an elevated position on the left flank. Chen would take a position on the right flank and pick off any Vrethani who tried to use the automated weapons platforms. The rest of the team would advance directly toward the trench line under covering fire, clear the trench, and push through to the gate. It was not elegant. It was not subtle. It was a frontal assault against a fortified position with a 12-person team. Brack, the Gorvathi heavy weapons specialist, looked at Kale with his small, deep-set eyes. "This is a human plan," he said. His voice a deep rumble that sounded like rocks grinding together. "It is," Kale agreed. Brack stared at him for a moment. Then his broad face split into something that might have been a grin. "Good," he said. "I like human plans. They are insane." Kale gave the signal, and everything happened at once. Brack opened up with his heavy plasma repeater, the weapon roaring as it sent a stream of superheated plasma into the Vrethani trench line. The impacts threw up fountains of dirt and rock and sent the Vrethani scrambling for cover. Donath fired his rotary grenade launcher in a steady rhythm, dropping high explosive rounds into the trench at precise intervals. Chen's marksman rifle began its quiet, deadly work, each shot finding its target with mechanical precision. A Vrethani soldier reached for the controls of an automated weapons platform and fell before his hand got there. Another tried to set up a crew-served energy weapon on the trench wall and crumpled as a tungsten round punched through his chest. The rest of the team charged. Kale was in front, not because he was trying to be heroic, but because he was the fastest and the hardest to kill. The Vrethani saw them coming and opened fire. Energy bolts screamed past Kale's head, so close he could feel the heat on his skin. One bolt hit the ground at his feet and sent a spray of molten rock into the air. He kept running. Torres was right behind him, firing her plasma carbine from the hip as she ran, not aiming precisely but putting enough fire downrange to keep the Vrethani heads down. Okafor was on his other side, her heavy frame pounding across the rocky ground with surprising speed. Behind them, Seraph and Villan ran with the resonance amplifiers on their backs, their 4 Talari legs eating up the distance. Reeves and Voss brought up the rear, firing and moving, firing and moving. They hit the trench line at full speed. Kale jumped the wall and landed in the trench among the Vrethani defenders. The close-quarters combat was brutal and fast. Vrethani were taller than humans and their reflexes were quick, but in the narrow confines of a trench, those advantages were reduced. Kale was a wall of force and fury, moving through the trench like a storm. He grabbed a Vrethani soldier by the arm and threw him into the trench wall with enough force to crack the reinforced concrete. He blocked an energy weapon that was swung at his head like a club and drove his fist into the attacker's chest, feeling ribs break under the impact. Torres was beside him, her carbine firing at point-blank range, each shot carefully placed. Okafor picked up a Vrethani soldier bodily and slammed him into the ground. The Gorvathi piled into the trench behind them, Brack swinging his massive fists with devastating effect while Donath used his grenade launcher's stock as a club. It was over in less than 2 minutes. The trench was clear. The automated weapons platforms were destroyed. 12 Rethani soldiers lay dead or unconscious in the mud. The breach team had taken casualties too. Voss had been hit in the shoulder by an energy bolt and was being treated by Reeves. Halloran had a deep cut across his forehead that was bleeding into his eyes. One of the Gorvathi, Donath, had taken a blast to his thick hide that had scorched but not penetrated his natural armor. He barely seemed to notice. Cale looked at the gate. It was right there, less than 200 meters away, close enough to touch, close enough to feel that strange pressure emanating from its surface. The eastern joint was directly ahead, that hairline fracture in the dark wall. He turned to Sarath. "How long to set up the amplifiers?" he asked. Sarath was already moving. 5 minutes, she said. "Maybe less." "Then move," Cale said. "We are running out of time." The team pushed forward to the base of the gate. Up close, it was even more imposing. The Vorium surface was not quite smooth. At this distance, Cale could see a faint texture, like the grain of very dense wood, but uniform and regular in a way that no natural material could be. He reached out and pressed his palm against it. The surface was neither warm nor cold. It felt like pressing his hand against solid nothing, as if the gate existed in a temperature of its own that had no relation to the air around it. He could feel the density of it through his skin, the sheer mass and weight of the material. It felt permanent. It felt eternal. It felt like something that had no business being broken. Sarath and Villan set up the resonance amplifiers on either side of the eastern joint, pressing the focusing arrays against the gate's surface. The arrays hummed as they made contact, a sound that Cale felt in his bones more than he heard with his ears. Sarath's 4 hands moved across the controls, making final adjustments. "The readings are stable," she said. "The Vorium is responding to the preliminary frequency. I am beginning the resonance cycle now." The amplifier's hum deepened and intensified. Cale could feel something changing in the air around the joint. The strange pressure he had felt from the gate shifted, becoming less uniform, more turbulent, like water starting to boil. The joint line, that hairline crack that was barely visible before, seemed to widen slightly. Not enough to see with the naked eye, but Cale could feel it. He could feel the material becoming uncertain of itself. 90 seconds, Sarath said. "The countdown begins now." Cale positioned himself in front of the joint. He planted his feet on the rocky ground and squared his shoulders. He pressed both palms against the gate, one on each side of the joint line. The Vorium hummed against his skin, vibrating at a frequency he could feel deep in his chest. He took a deep breath of the thin Volmara air and held it. Around him, the team had formed a defensive perimeter. Torres, Chen, Okafor, and the Gorvathi were spread out along the base of the gate, weapons pointed outward, watching for any Vrethani response. In the distance, the diversionary assault was still raging, but it sounded different now. Closer, like the Vrethani were starting to push back. 60 seconds, Sarath called out. The amplifiers were screaming now, a high-pitched whine that made everyone's teeth ache. The joint line was definitely wider, a visible crack no more than a millimeter across, but real, undeniably real. Cale could feel the Vorium weakening under his hands. It was still impossibly hard, still dense beyond anything he had ever touched, but there was something else there now, a flaw, a vulnerability, like finding a hairline fracture in a diamond. 30 seconds, Sarath said. Her voice was tight with a combination of hope and fear. The readings are at projected maximum. Molecular bond integrity is reduced by 11.8%. She paused. "Sergeant, it is now or never." Cale closed his eyes. He thought about every soldier who had died trying to break this gate. He thought about every assault that had failed, every weapon that had bounced off, every plan that had come to nothing against this wall of impossible material. He thought about Torres and her fierce grin and her belief that the Vrethani had built this gate because they were afraid. He thought about the thousands of soldiers fighting and dying right now on the Western Line, giving everything they had for this moment. And somewhere deep inside him, that thing that made humans different, that override that kicked in when everything was impossible and nothing mattered except what happened in the next second, that thing switched on. He felt his muscles tighten in a way that went beyond normal effort. He felt his bones take the strain in a way that should have broken them. He felt everything he was, every ounce of strength, and will and stubborn human refusal to accept the impossible, focus into his hands. And he struck. The sound that came from the gate was unlike anything anyone on that battlefield had ever heard. It was not the sharp crack of breaking stone or the metallic ring of fractured steel. It was deeper than that, lower than that, a sound that seemed to come from the planet itself, as if the ground beneath their feet was groaning in shock. The vorium at the joint line did not shatter the way normal materials shattered. It resisted. For one terrible, endless second, it resisted completely, and Cale felt every bone in his hand scream with the strain. The force he was generating would have crumpled a ground vehicle. It would have punched through the hull of a warship. Against the weakened vorium, it was barely enough, but barely enough was still enough. The crack appeared first as a sound, that deep groaning roar that shook the air. Then it appeared as a visible line, thin as a wire, running upward from the point where Cale's fists met the gate. The line spread like lightning frozen in slow motion, branching and forking as it climbed, each new fracture splitting into more fractures. The resonance amplifiers screamed at a pitch that was almost beyond hearing, and Sareth shouted something in Talari that Cale did not understand. The crack was spreading faster now, racing up the joint line toward the top of the gate, and pieces of vorium, tiny fragments no bigger than dust particles, began to fall from the surface like dark snow. Cale did not stop. He could not stop. The thing inside him, the override, the fury, whatever it was, had taken full control. He pulled his right fist back and struck again, and this time the crack widened. He could see through it. Not much, just a sliver of dim grey light from the other side of the gate. But it was there, a gap in the unbreakable wall. He struck again with his left fist, and the gap widened further. Pieces of vorium were falling now, not dust, but actual chunks. Fist-sized fragments of the hardest material in the galaxy dropping to the ground at his feet. Each fragment hit the rocky soil with a weight that seemed wrong for its size, leaving small craters where they landed. Torres was the first to react. She ran to the widening crack and shoved the barrel of her plasma carbine into the gap, firing blindly through to the other side to suppress any Vrithani defenders who might be waiting. The plasma bolts lit up the interior of the crack as they passed through, illuminating the fractured vorium from within. The material had a crystalline structure at its core. Cale could see it now, layers and layers of interlocking crystal matrices that caught the light and refracted it into colors he had no names for. 9,000 years of engineering, and he was tearing it apart with his hands. Sareth was at the amplifiers, her four hands flying across the controls. The resonance is cascading, she shouted over the noise. The fractures are propagating beyond the joint. The structural integrity of the surrounding segments is being compromised. She looked at Cale with wide eyes that held equal measures of terror and wonder. Sergeant, you need to keep going. The fracture network will stabilize and heal if you stop now. Cale gritted his teeth and drove his shoulder into the widening gap. The edges of the broken vorium cut through his jacket and into his skin. But he barely felt it. He pushed with everything he had, wedging himself into the crack and forcing it wider. The vorium groaned and creaked around him, the sound of a material being pushed past its limits for the first time in 9 millennia. Okafor was there suddenly, her big hands gripping the edge of the crack alongside his, pulling in the opposite direction. The Gorvathi. Brack added his massive strength, wrapping his thick fingers around a protruding slab of fractured vorium and heaving it outward. The slab broke free with a sound like a thunderclap, and suddenly the crack was a hole, a ragged opening in the siege gate maybe 2 meters wide and 3 meters tall. Cale stumbled through the hole and onto the other side. For a moment he stood there, breathing hard, his hands bleeding, his muscles shaking with the aftermath of exertion that had pushed his body beyond anything it was designed to do. The other side of the gate was a wide plaza of polished stone, leading up a gentle slope toward the Vrithani command citadel. The citadel was a massive structure of elegant spires and sweeping arches, built in the graceful Vrithani architectural style, all curves and flowing lines. It would have been beautiful if it were not the headquarters of an enemy that had killed millions. The plaza was not empty. A garrison of Vrithani soldiers was positioned along the citadel's outer walls, maybe 100 of them, and they were staring at the breach in the gate with expressions that Cale had never seen on Vrithani faces before. It took him a moment to recognize the emotion, because Vrithani were not expressive in the way humans were. Their faces were usually composed, controlled, revealing nothing. But now, every one of those pale, narrow faces was showing the same thing. It was fear. Pure, unfiltered, existential fear. They had lived their entire lives behind a wall that could not be broken. Their entire civilization, their entire military strategy, their entire sense of security was built on the absolute certainty that the siege gate would hold. And now there was a hole in it, and a bleeding human was standing on their side of it. And everything they had believed about the universe had just been proven wrong. The moment of shock lasted about 3 seconds. Then the Vrethani opened fire. Energy bolts screamed across the plaza, striking the ground around Kale and the team as they poured through the breach. Kale threw himself behind a stone column and returned fire with his sidearm. Torres came through the breach right behind him, her plasma carbine chattering as she laid down suppressive fire. Chen took a position at the edge of the breach and began picking off Vrethani soldiers with his marksman's rifle, each shot precise and lethal. Brack barreled through the hole like a living battering ram, his heavy plasma repeater roaring, and the Vrethani closest to the breach scattered before him. Kale's team was 12 people against 100. The numbers were bad, but the Vrethani were in disarray. The breach had shattered their confidence as completely as it had shattered the gate. They fought because they were soldiers and fighting was what they did, but there was a hesitation in their movements, an uncertainty that had not been there before. They kept glancing back at the gate, at the ragged hole in the wall that was not supposed to have holes, and each glance cost them a fraction of a second. In combat, fractions of seconds meant everything. Voss, despite his wounded shoulder, had gotten the communication equipment working and was transmitting on all coalition frequencies. "Breach confirmed," he said, his voice steady despite the pain. "Siege gate is compromised. Eastern section. Repeat, the siege gate is breached." The words went out across every coalition communication channel on the planet. In the command posts and bunkers and trenches of Firebase Korath, soldiers heard the message and stopped what they were doing. In the Western Assault, where 3 divisions were locked in brutal combat with the Vrethani defenders, the news spread like wildfire. On the coalition warships in orbit, bridge crews stared at their communication officers in disbelief. The gate had been breached. The unbreakable gate had been broken. Colonel Draven's response was immediate. "All units," he broadcast, "all available forces redirect to the eastern breach. Exploit the breach. I say again, exploit the breach. This is not a drill. The gate is down. Move." What happened next was something that military historians would study for centuries. The coalition forces on Volmara, hundreds of thousands of soldiers who had been grinding against the Vrethani defenses for 2 years, suddenly had what they had never had before, an opening. And they threw everything they had at it. But that was the big picture. In the plaza behind the gate, Kale and his team were fighting for their lives. The initial shock of the breach was wearing off and the Vrethani were reorganizing. More soldiers were pouring out of the citadel and someone with authority had taken command and was directing them into defensive positions around the breach. The energy fire was intensifying, and the team was pinned down behind the stone columns of the plaza. Reeves was working on Halloran, who had taken an energy bolt to the leg and was bleeding heavily. Donath, the Gorvathi, had been hit multiple times and even his thick hide was starting to show damage, blackened patches where the energy weapons had burned through. Kale assessed the situation quickly. They could not hold the breach with 12 people against a growing enemy force. They did not need to hold it forever, just long enough for the main coalition forces to reach them. But the main forces were kilometers away, and the Vrethani were right here. He needed to buy time, and the only way to buy time was to push forward. It was counterintuitive. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and in enemy territory. Every tactical manual ever written said to hold your position and wait for reinforcement. But Kale knew something that the tactical manuals did not account for. The Vrethani were afraid. For the first time in this entire war, the Vrethani were truly afraid. And fear, if you pushed into it hard enough, could become panic. "Torres, Chen, Okafor, with me," he said. "Brack, Donath, hold the breach. Sareth, Vilan, keep those amplifiers running. If the gate starts to heal, hit it again. Reeves, take care of the wounded." Everyone nodded. Kale stood up from behind his column, exposed himself to enemy fire for a deliberate second, and then charged straight at the Vrethani defensive line. It was a human thing to do. No other species in the galaxy would have done it. The Talari would have calculated the odds and found a clever way around the problem. The Gorvathi would have dug in and waited for reinforcements. Even the Vrethani, brave as they were, would have recognized the tactical futility of 4 people charging 100. But Kale was human, and Torres was human, and Chen was human, and Okafor was human, And humans had been doing tactically insane things since they first picked up rocks and threw them at predators 10 times their size on a dangerous little planet called Earth. Carl ran across the open plaza under a storm of energy fire. He moved in a zigzag pattern, changing direction unpredictably, making himself the hardest possible target. Torres ran beside him, her carbine firing in short, controlled bursts. Chen stayed further back, moving from cover to cover, his marksman's rifle dropping any Vrethani who tried to get a clear shot at KL. Okafor charged straight ahead like a runaway freight train, her body armor absorbing hits that would have killed a smaller person, roaring something in a language Kale did not recognize. The Vrethani line was centered on a low wall about 50 meters from the citadel entrance. There were maybe 30 soldiers behind it, with more coming from inside the citadel. Kale reached the wall first, vaulted over it, and landed among the defenders. The close-quarters combat was savage. Vrethani energy weapons were powerful at range but unwieldy in tight spaces. Kale's fists and elbows and knees were not unwieldy anywhere. He fought with the same ferocity he had used against the gate, his body moving on instinct, every strike driven by that deep human engine that turned desperation into power. A Vrethani soldier swung an energy rifle at his head. Kale caught it, twisted it out of the soldier's hands, and used it as a club to knock the next attacker sideways. Torres came over the wall a second after him, firing at point-blank range. Okafor simply ran through the wall, scattering stone and Vrethani soldiers in all directions. The Vrethani broke, not slowly, not gradually, but all at once, the way a dam breaks when the pressure becomes too much. The soldiers at the wall turned and ran toward the citadel, and their fear infected the soldiers behind them, and within 30 seconds the organized defensive line had dissolved into a retreating mob. Kale stood behind the shattered wall, breathing hard, watching them flee. His hands were bleeding from the gate, and now from the fighting. His body armor was scorched and dented. He had taken at least 2 glancing energy hits, and the skin on his left arm was blistered and raw. He did not feel any of it. The override was still in control, still pumping strength and focus through his system, keeping the pain at a distance. Torres appeared at his side, reloading her carbine. "They are running," she said, and there was something in her voice that was halfway between amazement and disbelief. Kale nodded. "They will regroup inside the citadel," he said. "We need to secure this area before they do." He turned and looked back at the breach in the siege gate. Through the ragged hole, he could see the terrain on the other side, the rocky ground and the distant hills and the smoke from the diversionary assault. And moving across that terrain, coming fast, were soldiers, coalition soldiers, hundreds of them, then thousands, streaming toward the breach from every direction. The word had gone out, and the response had been immediate. Ground vehicles and infantry and even a few light tanks were converging on the eastern gate, pouring through the gap that Kale had torn in the Unbreakable wall. The first wave of reinforcements reached the breach about 15 minutes after Kale had made it. They were soldiers from the 12th Infantry Brigade, a mixed unit of humans and Talari, and they came through the gate at a dead run with weapons blazing. Their commanding officer, a Talari major with the calm efficiency of her species, took one look at the tactical situation and immediately began deploying her troops to secure the plaza and push toward the citadel. More units followed, a constant stream of soldiers flowing through the breach like water through a crack in a dam. Within an hour, there were 5,000 coalition troops on the citadel side of the siege gate. Within 2 hours, there were 20,000. The Vathani attempted a counterattack about 90 minutes after the breach. They sent their elite guard units, the best soldiers they had, to push the coalition forces back and retake the plaza. The fighting was intense and bloody, and for a brief period it looked like the Vrethani might succeed. Their elite guards were formidable warriors, heavily armored and expertly trained, and they fought with the desperation of a species defending its most sacred stronghold. But the coalition forces kept coming, pouring through the breach in an endless stream, and the Vrethani could not stem the tide. The counterattack faltered and then failed, and the Vrethani elite guards fell back to the citadel's inner defenses. Kale's breach team was pulled off the front line as the reinforcements took over. They gathered in a relatively sheltered area near the base of the gate, and for the first time since the mission began, Kale had a chance to assess his team's condition. They were battered. Halloran was unconscious, his leg wound stabilized but serious. Voss was pale from blood loss but still functioning. Donarth's hide was a patchwork of burns and scorches. One of the Talari engineers, Villan, had taken shrapnel to 2 of her forearms and could not use them. Everyone else had minor wounds, cuts and burns and bruises from the trench assault and the plaza fighting. But they were all alive, all 12 of them. Against the odds, against every reasonable expectation, they were all still breathing. Torres sat down next to Cale on a piece of fallen masonry and offered him a canteen of water. He took it and drank deeply. The water was warm and tasted like metal, and it was the best thing he had ever tasted. "You did it," Torres said. "You actually did it. You broke the unbreakable gate." Cale looked at his hands. They were swollen and discolored, the knuckles torn open, blood drying in the creases of his skin. Medical scans would later reveal that he had fractured 17 bones in his hands and wrists during the assault on the gate. He had not noticed. The override had kept the pain away completely. It was starting to fade now, and a deep, throbbing ache was settling into his hands and arms like a slow tide coming in. "We all did it," Cale said. "Not just me." Torres shook her head. "We all helped, but you were the one who hit the wall." She paused. "I have been in this war for 11 months. I have seen a lot of things. I have seen bravery and cowardice and everything in between, but I have never seen anything like what you did today." She looked at the breach in the gate, where soldiers were still streaming through. "And I do not think the galaxy has either." The battle for the Citadel continued throughout the day and into the night. The Vrithani fought hard for every room, every corridor, every staircase. They were defending the heart of their fortress world, and they were not going to give it up easily. But the coalition forces had momentum and numbers, and something that was worth more than both of those things combined. They had belief. The unbreakable gate had been broken. The impossible had been made possible. And once you showed soldiers that the impossible could be done, there was no telling what they would do next. The planetary shield generator was located deep inside the Citadel, in a heavily fortified chamber that was itself protected by multiple layers of security. The coalition assault teams fought their way through the Citadel level by level, clearing rooms and securing corridors, pushing the Vrithani defenders deeper and deeper into their own stronghold. Cale and his breach team were no longer in the lead. That job had been taken over by fresh troops with full ammunition and unbroken bones. But Cale stayed close, following me advance, watching the Citadel fall piece by piece. It was late at night, Volmara time, when the assault teams reached the shield generator chamber. The Vrithani made their final stand there, 100 of their best soldiers arrayed in front of the massive machine that projected the planetary shield, the shield that kept the coalition fleet from bombing the planet into submission. The fighting in the chamber was desperate and close and loud. Energy weapons fire crisscrossed the air in a lethal web of light. Soldiers fell on both sides. But in the end, the coalition forces pushed through, and the last Vrithani defenders were overwhelmed. An engineering team rushed in and began the process of shutting down the shield generator. It was a massive device, filling the center of the chamber like the engine of some enormous ship, all glowing conduits and humming power cores. The Talari engineers worked quickly, their multiple hands an advantage as they disconnected systems and rerouted power. Within 20 minutes, the generator's hum began to fade. The lights on its surface flickered and went dark, and high above, visible through a crack in the Citadel's damaged roof, the faint shimmer of the planetary shield dissolved like mist in sunlight. The coalition fleet had been waiting. The moment the shield went down, they moved in. From orbit, warships rained fire on the remaining Vrithani defensive positions across the planet. Targets that had been untouchable for 2 years were suddenly exposed, and the fleet did not waste the opportunity. Anti-ship batteries that had dominated the skies were destroyed. Ground fortifications that had withstood months of assault crumbled under orbital bombardment. Vrithani supply depots and communication centers and troop concentrations were eliminated with surgical precision. By dawn the next morning, organized Vrithani resistance on Volmara had effectively ceased. Scattered pockets of soldiers still held out in isolated positions, but the command structure was gone, the defenses were gone, and the will to fight was fading. Vrithani commanders began broadcasting surrender offers on open frequencies, something that had never happened before in the history of the war. The fall of the siege gate had not just been a military defeat. It had been a psychological one. The gate had been the foundation of Vrithani confidence, the proof that they were untouchable, that their engineering and their civilization were superior, and a human had broken it with his bare hands. That fact rippled through the Vrithani military like a shockwave, destroying certainties and undermining resolve wherever it went. Cale did not see the surrender. By dawn, he was in a field hospital behind the old lines. lying on a cot while medics worked on his hands. The fractures were extensive, and the military doctors shook their heads in amazement as they reviewed the scans. 17 fractures, one of them said, metacarpals, phalanges, both wrists. He should not have been able to move these hands, let alone fight with them. Cale looked at his bandaged hands, now immobilized in medical braces that hummed softly as they promoted bone regeneration. He could feel the pain now, fully and completely. The override had faded hours ago, and what it left behind was a deep, exhausting agony that seemed to reach into every cell of his body. Torres was on the cot next to his. She had taken an energy bolt grazed to her ribs during the plaza fighting that she had not mentioned until after the Citadel fell. She was lying on her side, wincing every time she breathed, but she was smiling. "We won," she said. Cale closed his eyes. "We won," he agreed. His voice was quiet, tired, stripped of everything except the simple truth of the words. For the first time in 3 years, the war felt like something that might actually end. The news of the siege gate's fall traveled faster than any warship. It moved at the speed of light across communication relays, through quantum-entangled transmitters, through whispered conversations in barracks and mess halls and command centers on 100 different worlds. Within 48 hours of the breach, every sentient being in the Allied coalition knew what had happened on Volmara. Within 72 hours, every sentient being in the galaxy knew. The reactions were as varied as the species that had them. On Earth, in the great cities and the small towns and the orbital habitats, the news was received with a mixture of pride and stunned disbelief. Humans had been part of the galactic community for only 60 years. They were still the newcomers, still the species that other races regarded with a mixture of curiosity and unease. They had proven themselves in the war, fighting alongside the Telleri and the Gorvatar and the other coalition species with courage and tenacity. But breaking the siege gate was something else entirely. It was not just a military victory, it was a statement. A declaration that humanity was not just another species in the galaxy. It was something different, something that could do things no one else could do. Cale did not experience any of this firsthand. He spent the first week after the breach in the field hospital, lying on his cot while his hands healed inside their regeneration braces. The medical technology was advanced, using targeted stem cell therapy and sonic bone knitting to accelerate the healing process. But 17 fractures still took time. The doctors told him he would need at least 3 more weeks before the braces could come off, and several months of physical therapy after that. Carly accepted this with the same quiet patience he applied to everything. He had never been a man who railed against things he could not change. He just waited them out. The field hospital was full of soldiers from the Volmara campaign. Men and women and aliens who had been wounded in the diversionary assault, the breach and the Citadel fight. The ward Cale was in held about 30 patients. Their cots arranged in neat rows with medical equipment humming softly between them. The air smelled like antiseptic and healing salve, a sharp, clean scent that was somehow both comforting and depressing. Torres was in the cot next to his for the first few days, until her rib wound healed enough for her to be discharged back to active duty. She visited him every day after that, bringing him updates on the campaign and contraband snacks that she smuggled out of the officers' mess. The war on Volmara was winding down rapidly. With the planetary shield down and the siege gate breached, the Vrathani defensive network had collapsed like a house of cards. Isolated Vrathani units were surrendering in increasing numbers, and the coalition was moving swiftly to secure the planet's key infrastructure. The Vrathani command structure on Volmara had been decapitated when the Citadel fell, and without centralized coordination, the remaining defenders were fighting as individuals rather than as an army. Some fought to the last, unwilling to accept the shame of surrender. Others laid down their weapons and walked out of their positions with their hands raised, their faces bearing that same expression of bewildered fear that Cale had seen in the plaza. But Volmara was just one planet. The war was still being fought across dozens of star systems, and the fall of the siege gate, while strategically significant, did not end the conflict overnight. What it did was shift the momentum decisively in the coalition's favor. Volmara had been the anchor of the Vrathani defensive line. With it gone, the entire strategic picture changed. Supply lines that had been secure were now exposed. Defensive positions that had relied on Volmara's covering fire were now vulnerable. The Vrathani High Command was forced to redraw its entire defensive strategy, pulling back forces from forward positions to establish a new line deeper in their territory. The coalition pursued them relentlessly. pushing into systems that had been Vrethani-controlled for decades. Kale followed the war's progress from his hospital cot, reading reports on a datapad that Taurus had left for him. The reports were dry and factual, written in the clipped language of military intelligence, but the story they told was dramatic. System after system was falling to the coalition advance. Vrethani garrisons that had held their positions for years were abandoning them and retreating. The Vrethani navy, which had dominated several key sectors, was pulling back to protect the core worlds. For the first time since the war began, the coalition was on the offensive everywhere. Visitors started coming. At first it was just officers from the 9th Division who wanted to congratulate him and shake his hand, which was impossible because his hands were in braces, so they settled for awkward shoulder pats. Then it was senior officers from other divisions, colonels and generals who had heard about the breach and wanted to meet the man who had done it. Then it was journalists, first military correspondents who wrote for coalition news services, then civilian reporters who had made the dangerous journey to Volmara to cover what was now being called the most significant military operation of the war. Karl did not enjoy the attention. He answered questions politely but briefly, deflecting credit to his team whenever possible. When a reporter from Earth's Central News Network asked him how it felt to do the impossible, Kale thought about it for a moment and then said, "It felt like breaking my hands." The reporter had laughed, but Kale had not been joking. The most interesting visitor came on the 9th day. Kale was reading a report about coalition advances in the Dereth sector when a Vrethani walked into the ward. The reaction from the other patients was immediate and electric. Hands reached for weapons that were not there. Eyes narrowed. Muscles tensed. The war was still going on, and every person in that ward had been wounded by Vrethani weapons. Seeing one walking freely into their hospital triggered instincts that were hard to override. The Vrethani was tall, even by the standards of his species, and he moved with a careful, measured grace that suggested he was very aware of the hostility his presence was generating. He wore simple clothing rather than military uniform, pale grey garments that hung loosely on his lean frame. His face was composed, revealing nothing, but his large dark eyes moved constantly, taking in everything around him. He was accompanied by a coalition military escort, 2 human soldiers who looked distinctly uncomfortable with their assignment. The Vrethani walked directly to Kale's cot and stopped. He stood there for a moment, looking down at Kale with an expression that was difficult to read. Then he spoke, and his voice was the soft, slightly musical tone that all Vrethani had, a sound that was strangely pleasant despite coming from an enemy. "My name is Baelith Tan," he said. "I am a scholar. I study military history and the science of materials. I have been granted permission by both the Vrethani Diplomatic Service and the Coalition Military Authority to speak with you." Kale looked at the Vrethani for a long moment. Then he looked at the 2 escort soldiers, who nodded to confirm that the visitor was authorized. He looked back at Baelith. "What do you want to talk about?" Kale asked. Baelith pulled a chair from beside an empty cot and sat down. His movements were precise and unhurried, like everything he did was carefully considered before he did it. "I want to understand what happened at the gate," he said. Kale raised an eyebrow. "I broke it. That is what happened." Baelith shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "That is what you did. It is not what happened. What happened is something that should not be possible, and I need to understand why it was." Baelith reached into a bag he carried and produced a datapad. He activated it and showed Kale a series of diagrams and charts that meant nothing to Kale but clearly meant a great deal to Baelith. "Thorium was developed by Vrethani scientists 8,700 years ago," Baelith said. "It was engineered at the molecular level to be impervious to any known force. Its crystal lattice structure distributes energy so efficiently that concentrated force is immediately spread across the entire material. A point impact becomes a surface impact. A focused blow becomes a distributed load. This is why weapons do not work against it. No matter how powerful the weapon, the energy is absorbed and dispersed before it can cause structural damage." Kale was listening, despite himself. He had never given much thought to the science behind the gate. He had just been told to break it, and he had broken it. But Baelith's explanation was making him understand for the first time just how extraordinary what he had done actually was. Baelith continued, "Our engineers have analyzed the fracture pattern in the gate. The resonance amplifiers your team used did weaken the molecular bonds in the joint area, that is true, but the weakening was insufficient to explain the breach. A 12% reduction in bond integrity still leaves Vorium far stronger than any other known material. The force required to fracture even weakened Vorium at the joint should have been beyond any biological organism's capacity. He looked at Kale with those large, dark eyes. Yet you did it. The fracture pattern is consistent with a single point of impact generating force that our models say is impossible for a living being to produce. So either our models are wrong or something happened that we do not understand. Kale flexed his fingers inside the regeneration braces, feeling the bones ache in response. What do your models say about humans? He asked. Valeth's expression changed subtly. It was hard to tell with Vrethani faces, but Kale thought he saw something that might have been embarrassment. Our models of human physiology were inadequate, Valeth admitted. We based them on the standard biological surveys that were conducted when your species was first contacted. Those surveys measured human physical capabilities under controlled conditions. Volunteers performing standardized tests. The results showed that humans were strong by galactic standards, but not extraordinarily so. Certainly not strong enough to damage Vorium under any circumstances. He paused. What we failed to account for, Valeth said, is that humans do not perform to their maximum capacity under controlled conditions. Your species has a latent reserve of physical and psychological capability that only manifests under extreme stress. We knew about this phenomenon in theory. Your scientists call it hysterical strength, the ability to perform feats of physical power under life-threatening conditions that exceed normal human limits by factors of 10 or more. But we treated it as an anomaly, a rare occurrence that was statistically insignificant. We did not understand that for some humans, particularly those who have been conditioned by years of extreme physical and psychological stress, this reserve can be accessed deliberately. You, Sergeant Morrow, appear to be one of those humans. He thought about all the times in his life when he had done things that should have been beyond his ability. The blast door on Brennan's Reach. The hand-to-hand fighting in the trenches on Desra. The time years ago when he was just a teenager, when a structural collapse in the mining colony where he grew up had trapped his younger sister under a beam of construction-grade steel, and he had lifted it off her with one arm while pulling her free with the other. He had always known he was strong. He had just never thought much about why. Valeth leaned forward in his chair. I did not come here to praise you, Sergeant, he said. I came here because what you did has created a crisis in Vrethani society that extends far beyond the military situation. The siege gate was not just a defensive structure, it was a symbol. For 9,000 years it represented the supremacy of Vrethani engineering, the idea that our intellect and our technology could create things that were beyond the reach of the physical world, things that could not be touched by brute force, no matter how great. The gate was proof that mind was superior to muscle, that civilized intelligence would always triumph over raw physical power. His voice was quiet now, almost gentle. And then you came along and proved that wrong, he said, with your bare hands. Do you understand what that means to my people? It is not just that we lost a fortress. It is that we lost a certainty, a belief about the universe that was so deep it was almost religious. You did not just break a gate, Sergeant. You broke an idea, and broken ideas are much harder to repair than broken walls. Kale was quiet for a long time after Valeth finished speaking. He looked at his bandaged hands, at the regeneration braces that hummed softly as they knitted his shattered bones back together. He thought about what Valeth had said, about ideas and certainties and the things that happened when they were broken. He thought about the Vrethani soldiers in the plaza, the fear on their faces, the way their entire worldview had collapsed in the moment the gate cracked. And he felt something unexpected. He felt sorry for them. I did not break your gate to prove a point, Kale said finally. I broke it because there was a war, and the gate was in the way, and people were dying because of it. That is all. Valeth studied him with those dark, alien eyes. Perhaps, he said, but the universe does not care about intentions. It only cares about results. And the result of what you did is that the Vrethani people are now forced to confront a truth they have been avoiding for a very long time. We are not invincible. Our technology is not supreme. And there are things in this galaxy that do not conform to our models or our expectations. He paused. Your species is one of those things. Valeth visited 2 more times over the following days. Each visit was a long, quiet conversation that covered topics ranging from Vrethani history to human evolution to the philosophy of war and the nature of strength. Kale found himself enjoying the conversations despite himself. Valeth was intelligent and thoughtful and genuinely curious. not hostile or bitter, despite the fact that his civilization was losing a war to the species Kale represented. He asked questions that no one else had asked, questions about what Kale felt during the breach, what he was thinking, what the experience of the override was like from the inside. Kale tried to answer honestly, although some of the experiences were hard to put into words. "It is like there are two versions of me," he said during one conversation. "There is the normal version, the one that feels pain and fear and doubt. And then there is the other version, the one that takes over when things get bad enough. That version does not feel those things, or maybe it feels them, but it does not care about them. It just keeps going." Valeth nodded. "Your species evolved on a world that was trying to kill you at all times," he said. "Predators, diseases, natural disasters, even the climate itself was hostile. Most species evolved to avoid danger. Humans evolved to survive it, to push through it, to endure what cannot be endured, and do what cannot be done. It is a remarkable adaptation. It is also terrifying." The wider war continued to shift in the Coalition's favor during Kale's recovery. The strategic impact of Volmara's fall was even greater than the military planners had predicted. The Brethani defensive line had not just been broken, it had been shattered. Coalition forces were advancing on multiple fronts, taking systems that had been contested for years. The Brethani Navy fought hard in several engagements, inflicting significant casualties on the Coalition fleet, but the overall trajectory was clear. The Brethani were losing. More importantly, the psychological impact of the siege gate's fall was spreading through the Brethani military like a contagion. Reports from the front lines described Brethani units that were fighting with less conviction, commanders who were more willing to negotiate, garrisons that surrendered rather than fighting to the last. The Unbreakable Gate had been the keystone of Brethani morale, and its destruction had cracked something fundamental in their collective spirit. Not all Brethani reacted the same way, of course. Some fought harder than ever, driven by anger and shame. But the overall trend was unmistakable. The war was winding down. Kale's braces came off after 4 weeks. The bones had healed cleanly thanks to the advanced medical technology, but his hands felt different, weaker, stiffer, not quite the tools they had been before. The physical therapist, a cheerful Talari woman named Kessa, told him this was normal and that full strength would return with time and exercise. She gave him a regimen of exercises to perform daily, squeezing balls, flexing fingers, gripping and releasing objects of increasing resistance. Kale performed them diligently 3 times a day, sitting on his cot in the now half-empty ward and slowly working his hands back to life. Torres came by during one of his therapy sessions, watching him squeeze a rubber ball with intense concentration. She had been promoted to corporal after the breach, and she wore the new rank insignia with a mix of pride and self-consciousness. She sat on the edge of his cot and watched him work his hands for a while before speaking. "There is talk about you," she said. "What kind of talk?" Kale asked, not looking up from the ball. "The kind of talk that happens when someone does something that changes the course of a war," Torres said. "The Coalition Command is calling the breach the turning point. The historians are already writing about it. They are calling it the Fist of Volmara." She paused. "There are people who want to make you a symbol, Kale, the human who broke the Unbreakable Gate. The face of human capability. The proof that humanity belongs at the top of the galactic order." Kale stopped squeezing the ball and looked at her. "I do not want to be a symbol," he said. Torres smiled sadly. "I know. But sometimes it does not matter what we want. Sometimes events are bigger than the people who cause them." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "They are giving you the Coalition Star of Valor," she said. "Highest military decoration in the Alliance. The ceremony is in 3 weeks, back on Earth. Full military honors. Live broadcast to every Coalition world." She handed him the paper. Kale unfolded it and read the formal notification. The language was stiff and official, full of phrases like extraordinary heroism and decisive contribution to the war effort. It felt like it was describing someone else. He folded the paper and put it on his bedside table. The last conversation he had with Valeth was the most memorable. The Brethani scholar came to the ward on the day before Kale was scheduled to leave Volmara. The ward was nearly empty now, most of the wounded having either healed and returned to duty or been evacuated to medical facilities on other worlds. Valeth sat in his usual chair, and for a while they sat in comfortable silence, watching the dim red sunlight filter through the ward's windows. I have completed my analysis of the breach, Valith said eventually. I have written a report for the Vrathani Science Council. It will be published and made available to all species. Kale looked at him. What does it say? Valith was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. It says that Vorium is not truly unbreakable, he said. It says that our certainty about its invincibility was based on incomplete data. We tested it against every weapon, every technology, every force-generating device we could conceive of. But we never tested it against something that did not obey the rules we expected. We never accounted for the possibility that a living being could generate force in a way that our physics models could not predict. He looked at Kale. Your species does not operate within the parameters we assumed. You are not constrained by the biological limits we projected. Under sufficient motivation, humans can exceed those limits by margins that we would have considered impossible. And that, Valith said, is the lesson the Vrathani need to learn. Not that our technology failed, but that our understanding of what is possible was too narrow. Kale considered this. He thought about all the humans he had known and served with, soldiers and civilians and children. He thought about their stubbornness and their courage and their infuriating, beautiful refusal to accept that anything was truly impossible. And he thought about the Vrathani, a species that had built the most incredible defensive structure in the galaxy and believed it would stand forever, only to watch a single human tear it apart. There was a sadness in that, and a lesson, and maybe something that looked like hope. I hope we can stop fighting soon, Kale said. Valith nodded. So do I, he said. And for the first time, I believe we can. Because if humans can break the things we thought were unbreakable, then perhaps they can also build the things we thought could not be built, like peace. Kale looked at his hands, healed now but still aching, still carrying the memory of what they had done. Maybe, he said. He meant it. The transport ship that took Kale back to Earth was a military vessel, but it was nothing like the crowded, uncomfortable carrier that had taken him to Volmara months earlier. This was a diplomatic transport, clean and quiet, with actual quarters instead of metal benches, and food that tasted like food instead of flavored paste. He had been given a private cabin, a small room with a bed and a viewport, and a desk with a terminal. The door closed behind him, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Kale was alone, truly alone, without the sounds of other soldiers sleeping and breathing and muttering in their dreams, without the distant rumble of artillery or the hum of energy shields. Just silence and the gentle vibration of the ship's engines. He sat on the bed and looked at his hands. The bones had healed. The skin had regenerated. There were no visible scars from the breach, thanks to the advanced medical treatment. His hands looked exactly the way they had looked before Volmara, broad and strong and calloused from years of hard use. But they felt different, not weaker exactly. The strength was still there. A deep reservoir of physical power that sat in his muscles and bones like something waiting to be called upon. But there was a new awareness that came with it, a knowledge of what those hands had done and what it had cost. 17 fractures. Doctors said he was lucky he had not lost the use of them permanently. Lucky was a strange word to use about something that had been a deliberate choice. The journey to Earth took 8 days. Hale spent most of that time in his cabin, reading and sleeping and doing his hand exercises. He also wrote letters to the families of every soldier who had been killed in the diversionary assault. There were a lot of letters. The diversionary assault had cost the coalition over 3,000 casualties, including nearly 800 dead, 800 men and women and aliens who had charged into a wall of fire so that 12 people could sneak through the back door. Kale wrote each letter by hand using a stylus and a datapad because typing on a keyboard still hurt his fingers. He told each family what their loved one had done and why it mattered, and that their sacrifice had not been in vain. He did not know if the letters helped. He wrote them anyway because it was the right thing to do. Torres had sent him messages during the journey, updating him on the team's status. Everyone was recovering well. Halloran's leg was healing, and the doctors said he would walk without a limp. Boss's shoulder was fully repaired. Donnath's burns had healed over with new hide that was slightly darker than the rest, giving him a mottled appearance that the other Gorvathi told him made him look distinguished. Vilan's damaged arms were being treated with Talari regenerative techniques that would restore full function within a few months. The breach team had been together through something extraordinary, and the bond between them was the kind that did not fade with time or distance. Torres also told him that the war was accelerating toward its conclusion. The Vrathani had opened formal peace negotiations with the coalition, The first time in the 3-year conflict that they had been willing to sit at a table and talk. The negotiations were being held on a neutral station in the Tessari system, and representatives from all coalition species were present. The Vrathani negotiating team was led by a senior diplomat whose name Torres said she could not pronounce, along with a military advisor and, surprisingly, a scholar. Kale wondered if the scholar was Valith. The transport arrived in Earth's solar system on the 8th day, dropping out of faster-than-light travel near the orbit of Mars. From there, it was a short, conventional flight to Earth itself. Kale watched through the viewport as the planet grew from a blue-white dot to a sphere that filled the entire window. He had not been back to Earth in almost 4 years. The last time he had seen it, he'd been shipping out to his first deployment of the war. A young sergeant with clean boots and unbroken hands. The planet looked the same from orbit. Blue oceans and green continents and white clouds swirling in patterns that had been there for billions of years. But he knew that down on the surface, things had changed. The war had changed them. The galaxy had changed them. And what he had done on Volmara had changed them most of all. The ceremony was held at Coalition Military Command headquarters in Geneva. The building was a massive complex of glass and steel that sat on the shore of Lake Geneva. Its architecture a blend of human and alien design elements that reflected the multinational, multi-species nature of the coalition. The ceremony hall was enormous, a vaulted space with seating for several thousand people and a raised stage at one end draped in the flags and banners of every coalition member species. The ceiling was transparent, showing the sky above, and on this particular day the sky was a deep, clear blue that made the hall feel open and infinite. Kale arrived in his dress uniform, which he had not worn in years and which felt stiff and unfamiliar. Torres was with him, also in dress uniform, along with the other surviving members of the breach team. Halloran was walking with a slight limp, but refused any assistance. Voss had his arm in a decorative sling that matched his uniform. Brack and Donath were wearing the Gorvathi equivalent of formal military attire, which consisted of polished armor plates over their natural hide. Sarath and Villan wore Talari ceremonial robes, long flowing garments in the deep blue color of their engineering corps. They looked, Kale thought, like a group of people who had been through something together and come out the other side. The ceremony hall was packed. Soldiers, diplomats, scientists, journalists, and ordinary citizens filled every seat. Representatives from every coalition species were present, their diverse forms creating a mosaic of alien biology that still struck Kale as remarkable, even after years of working alongside non-human species. Teleri sat tall and elegant in their seats, their forearms folded neatly. Gorvathi hunched in chairs that were slightly too small for them. Their broad faces turned toward the stage with stoic attention. Humans filled the majority of the seats, their faces showing the full range of human emotion from pride to curiosity to the particular blank expression that soldiers wore when they were feeling things too complex for their faces to express. A lot of speeches. The Coalition Supreme Commander, a Talari admiral named Sarath Voss, no relation to the communications specialist, spoke about the significance of the Volmara campaign and the strategic impact of the siege gate's fall. She spoke well, with the precise, measured eloquence that Talari were known for, and her words were translated simultaneously into every language represented in the hall. Then the Human Secretary General of the Coalition spoke, a grey-haired woman named Adaze who had a politician's gift for making large events feel personal. She talked about sacrifice and courage and the bonds that formed between species when they fought together for a common cause. She talked about the soldiers who had died in the diversionary assault, and the hall went quiet in a way that was deeper than silence. Then they called Kale's name. He stood up from his seat in the front row and walked to the stage. The walk felt very long. The stage was elevated about a meter above the floor of the hall, and as Kale climbed the steps, he could see every face in the audience. Thousands of eyes, human and alien, all looking at him. He was not a man who sought attention, and the weight of all those gazes was almost physical. He stood at attention on the stage while Admiral Sarath read the citation for the Coalition Star of Valor. The citation described the breach in formal military language, detailing the plan, the execution, the combat, and the moment when Kale had struck the gate. It was accurate, but clinical, like a medical report about a miracle. The medal itself was a simple thing, a star-shaped piece of polished metal on a ribbon of deep blue and gold. It was lightweight, almost fragile, and it seemed absurd that something so small could represent something so large. Admiral Sereth pinned it to Cale's chest, and the hall erupted in applause. The sound washed over him like a wave, and for a moment he did not know what to do. Then Torres, who was standing with the team at the side of the stage, caught his eye and gave him a small nod, just a nod. But it said everything. You earned this. It is okay to accept it. Cale was supposed to give a speech. He had been given a prepared text written by a military public affairs officer, full of stirring phrases about human determination and coalition unity and the triumph of the spirit over the material. It was a good speech. He had read it on the transport and acknowledged that it would sound excellent delivered by someone who was comfortable speaking to thousands of people. He was not that person. He stepped to the podium and looked out at the audience. He could see Torres and the team. He could see Colonel Draven, who had made the journey from Volmara for the ceremony. He could see rows and rows of soldiers, some of whom he recognized from the Volmara campaign, and far in the back of the hall, standing apart from the coalition delegates, he could see a small group of Rethani. They were observers, part of the peace negotiation delegation that had been invited to attend the ceremony as a gesture of goodwill. Among them, tall and still, was Valeth Tarn. Cale took the prepared speech out of his pocket, looked at it, and put it back, and he spoke. I am not good at speeches, he said. His voice was quiet, but the hall's audio system carried it to every seat. I am a soldier. I have been a soldier for 15 years. I know how to follow orders and how to lead a team and how to fight when fighting is what needs to be done. I do not know how to stand in front of thousands of people and say important things, so I am just going to say what is true. He paused. The hall was completely silent. What happened at the siege gate was not about me, he said. It was about a team of 12 people who walked 3 kilometers across open ground under enemy fire because they were told the war might end if they did. It was about 2 Teleri engineers who carried 60-pound devices on their backs across a battlefield and made them work under conditions that no laboratory could simulate. It was about 2 Gorvathi soldiers who stood their ground against odds that would have broken most people and held a breach open through sheer stubbornness. It was about human soldiers who charged a fortified position because they believed that the person next to them was worth dying for. He looked at the team standing at the side of the stage. Torres was blinking hard. Halloran was standing very straight. Brack was motionless, which for a Gorvathi was the equivalent of deep emotion. And it was about 3,000 soldiers who attacked the western line knowing full well that they were a distraction. Cale continued, knowing that their job was to bleed so that someone else could succeed. 800 of them did not come home. I wrote letters to their families on the way here. I told them what their people did and why it mattered, but letters are not enough. They will never be enough. He gripped the edges of the podium with his healed hands. He could feel the wood under his fingers, solid and real. People keep asking me how I broke the gate, he said. They want to know the technique, the science, the secret. There is no secret. I hit it as hard as I could because people I cared about were counting on me, and there was nothing else left to try. That is not heroism. That is desperation. And the only reason my desperation worked when so many others had failed is because I had a team behind me that made it possible. He looked toward the back of the hall where the Rethani delegation stood. I have been told that breaking the gate broke something else too, he said. Something in the Vrethani that went deeper than military strategy. An idea about the universe and their place in it. I am sorry for that. I know what it feels like to have your certainties taken away. It happened to me the day I was told I was being sent to Volmara, the day I realized that the war I had been fighting for 3 years might not be winnable. He straightened up. But here is what I learned, he said. When your certainties break, you have a choice. You can try to rebuild them exactly as they were, or you can build something better. The Vrethani built the siege gate because they believed the universe was something to be controlled, to be defended against, to be kept out. They built the strongest wall anyone had ever seen and put it between themselves and everything else. And a human broke it, not because humans are stronger or better or more important than anyone else, but because humans do not believe in unbreakable walls. We look at a wall and we think, there must be a way through, and we keep trying until we find it or until we die. That is not superior. It is just different. And maybe, now that the wall is down, we can start figuring out what we can build when we stop trying to keep each other out. He stopped talking. The silence in the hall lasted for 3 seconds, and then the applause started. It was not polite applause or ceremonial applause. It was the kind of applause that comes from people who have heard something true, a deep and sustained sound that filled the hall and spilled out into the corridors beyond. Kyle stood at the podium and let it wash over him, and for the first time in a very long time, he felt something that might have been peace. The peace negotiations concluded 4 months later. The Treaty of Tesserae, as it came to be known, ended the war and established a framework for Vrethani integration into the broader galactic community. The terms were firm but not punitive. The coalition insisted on disarmament of certain Vrethani weapon systems and the dismantling of several fortress worlds, but they also offered economic partnership, technology exchange, and full membership in the coalition for any Vrethani world that chose to join. Most did. The Vrethani people, freed from the rigid military hierarchy that had governed them for centuries, proved to be eager participants in galactic society. Their engineering expertise, the same brilliance that had created Vorium and the Siege Gate, was redirected toward peaceful purposes. Vrethani materials scientists collaborated with Talari physicists and human engineers to develop technologies that advanced medicine, construction, energy production, and space travel by decades in just a few years. Valeth Tarn published his analysis of the Siege Gate breach, and it became one of the most widely read scientific papers in galactic history. His conclusion that the Vrethani had failed to account for human adaptive physiology sparked a broader scientific inquiry into the unique characteristics of every species in the coalition. The research revealed that every species had capabilities that others had underestimated, abilities and adaptations that had been overlooked because they did not fit neatly into existing models. The Gorvathi, for example, turned out to have an extraordinary capacity for chemical analysis through their skin, an ability that made them natural environmental scientists. The Talari had a form of spatial memory that allowed them to visualize complex three-dimensional structures with perfect accuracy, a talent that revolutionized architecture and ship design. And humans, of course, had their stubbornness, their override, their inexplicable ability to exceed their own limits when the situation demanded it. Kale left the military 6 months after the ceremony. He had served for 16 years, and the war's end gave him a reason to stop that he had never had before. He was offered promotions, advisory positions, ambassadorships, and every other form of recognition that a grateful civilization could bestow. He turned them all down. He wanted something simpler, something quieter. He returned to the mining colony where he had grown up, a small settlement on a rocky moon in the outer reaches of human-controlled space. The colony had grown since he left. New buildings and new people and new industries, but the landscape was the same. Grey rock and thin air and a sky full of stars. It felt like home in a way that nowhere else ever had. He built a house on the edge of the settlement, a simple structure of local stone and imported timber that he constructed mostly with his own hands. The work was slow and satisfying, each stone placed with care, each beam fitted with precision. His hands, fully healed now, were as strong as they had ever been. Maybe stronger, but he used them gently, with a patience that surprised even himself. There was no urgency in building a house. There was no countdown, no enemy fire, no need for the override, just the quiet work of placing one stone on top of another and making something that would last. Torres visited him twice in the first year. She had stayed in the military and was rising quickly through the ranks, her combination of combat experience and natural leadership marking her for a distinguished career. She stood in the doorway of his half-finished house, looking around at the stone walls and the view of the valley below, and shook her head. "You could be commanding a division right now," she said. "You could be sitting in a general's office on Earth, making decisions that shape the future of the coalition, and instead you are building a rock house on the edge of nowhere." Kaol set down the stone he was holding and wiped dust from his hands. "Generals do not shape the future," he said. "They react to it. I would rather build something." Torres looked at him for a long moment, and then she laughed. "You are the strangest hero I have ever met," she said. Kael picked up another stone and set it in place. "Good," he said. The siege gate itself became a monument. The coalition and the Vrethani agreed to preserve the breach rather than repair it, leaving the ragged hole in the dark Vorium wall as a permanent reminder of what had happened there. The plaza behind the gate was redesigned as a memorial park with gardens and walkways and a simple stone monument inscribed with the names of every soldier who had died in the Volmara campaign. The breach in the gate drew visitors from across the galaxy, millions of beings who came to stand before the unbreakable wall and look through the hole that a human had made in it. Some came out of curiosity. Some came out of reverence. Some came to touch the fractured vorium and feel for themselves the impossible thing that had been made possible. Gale never went back. He had no desire to stand before the gate again, to see the place where he had broken his hands and perhaps broken something larger. He had done what needed to be done, and that was enough. The memory lived in his hands, in the faint ache that still visited his knuckles on cold mornings, in the way his fingers sometimes trembled when he gripped something too tightly. It lived in the letters he received from the families of fallen soldiers, some grateful, some angry, all of them honest. It lived in the quiet moments late at night when he sat on the porch of his stone house and looked at the stars and thought about the people he had fought with and the people he had fought against, and the strange, improbable fact that they were all at peace now. Years passed. The galaxy changed. The coalition expanded and evolved, absorbing new species and new ideas and new challenges. The war with the Vrathani faded from current events into recent history, and then into the kind of history that children studied in school. The breach of the siege gate became a chapter in textbooks, analyzed and debated by historians and military theorists and philosophers who all had different opinions about what it meant and why it mattered. Some called it the moment humanity proved its worth to the galaxy. Others called it the moment the galaxy realized it had been underestimating all of its members. Others simply called it what it was, a desperate act by a desperate man in a desperate war, an act that happened to change everything. Cale read some of these analyses and ignored most of them. He had his own understanding of what had happened, and it was simpler than any academic theory. He had been given a job. He had done the job. The job had required him to break something that could not be broken, so he had broken it. That was the human way. Not because humans were better or smarter or stronger than anyone else, but because humans looked at impossible things and refused to accept the impossibility. They questioned it. They challenged it. They pushed against it until it gave way, or they did. And sometimes, on rare and extraordinary occasions, it was the impossible thing that gave way first. On a warm evening, many years after the war, Cale sat on the porch of his stone house and watched the stars come out. The sky on this little moon was always full of stars, thousands of them, each one a sun with its own worlds and its own stories. Somewhere out there was Volmara, grey and cold and scarred by war, with a monument standing where the greatest fortress in the galaxy had once been unbreachable. Somewhere out there were his old teammates, Torres commanding a carrier group, Chen retired and teaching marksmanship, Okafor running a veterans rehabilitation centre, Brack and Donath back on their homeworld telling stories to their grandchildren. Somewhere out there was Valeth, writing books and giving lectures about the day his people's certainties had crumbled. Cale looked at his hands in the starlight. They were older now, the skin rougher, the knuckles thicker, but they were steady and strong. Hands that had broken the unbreakable. Hands that had built a house. Hands that had written letters to the families of the dead and held the hands of the living. They were just hands. That was the truth of it. Human hands made of bone and muscle and skin, fragile and impermanent and mortal. And yet they had done something that the entire galaxy had said could not be done. He flexed his fingers, feeling the old familiar strength in them, and smiled. Then he went inside, closed the door against the cold night air, and slept the deep, dreamless sleep of a man who had nothing left to prove.